Hello and welcome to our third Monday Music for Soccerology members. Today I've got a very special guest, Professor Paul Laursen. Paul has over 125 peer-reviewed articles. He's interested in HRV, high-intensity interval training, thermoregulation. Paul has completed 17 Ironmans, which is obviously not my area, and is the co-founder of the brilliant HIIT Science. But I won't really steal Paul's thunder. He's going to do a presentation for us today. So welcome, Paul.
Hey, thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me on board with everyone here at Soccerology. That's right. So that's awesome. Sounds like a great initiative, and we're so super stoked to support it. So maybe we'll crack straight into my presentation, and hopefully a lot of it will introduce itself. So I'll just do the share screen. I believe here. Oh, it says host is disabled share screen. So maybe you can just change that for me.
Try that for me.
All right.
There we go.
Share screen. Perfect. And let me just, yeah, should be this one. See how that comes up. Perfect. Can you see that there, Andrew?
I can, yeah.
Awesome, rock and roll. Well, yeah, so we are the science and application of high intensity interval training. So it's basically the short version is Martin Buchheit and I wrote a book, the Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training with Human Kinetics Publishers. And then when we were doing the book, we kind of said, there's so much good stuff in here, but we also need a course too. So we also do a course accredited around the world by all the governing bodies. And due to COVID-19, we're actually offering our largest discount ever at 40% off using the coupon code HIIT Science 40. So if anyone is interested in this, after they read through this, please use that coupon code. And I believe that's even better than the Soccerology coupon code, which you can use after if you're watching this video after. This is still live until the 17th of the month of May, and then it reverts to back to not as good a discount. So get in there if this is of interest to you. And yeah, I'll just give you some background on where I come from. As Andrew alluded to, I'm a triathlete by trade. My sport of passion was the sport of triathlon. That one inspired me when I was a youth. And I always say I'm a bit of a semi-pro. Martin and I both say that we were decent athletes, but never good enough. And I think it's that the fact that we weren't good enough that drove us to try to learn more about physiology so that we could better ourselves. So and that took me into basically failing as a triathlete. Took me into studying the sports sciences I come from Vancouver, and I did my initial studies at the University of British Columbia. And then I was fortunate to get a scholarship to Australia. We were really kicking goals in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, and I did my PhD down there at the University of Queensland. And then that work caught the attention. It was in high intensity interval training, which was just starting to take off back in there, just starting to understand it a little bit. And that took me to doing work with the Australian Institute of Sport over to Perth, Australia, where Martin and I met, actually. I'll come back to that. And then that was a period of a decade, and that work caught the interest of the New Zealand Olympic program, where I took a joint position with AUT University, and the New Zealand Olympic program also caught the love of coaching while I was down there, and the use of technology. And basically, 2 Olympic cycles, and then met a gal who was from Revelstoke, British Columbia, and that's where I've moved back to. So I just work from home, coach athletes online, triathletes online, and run HIIT Science ultimately. So that's me in a nutshell. And really coming back to Perth, Australia, that's where Martin and I really met, and we came together really trying to solve the puzzle, trying to figure out how you could use HIIT training to condition yourself optimally, whether you're a triathlete like myself, or whether you're more interested in team sports like Martin. So Martin's really the team sports sort of guru. But yeah, we started manipulating the variables there. So Martin's over here. This is Professor Ken Nisaka who funded us. And that's Mark Quad, who wrote the cycling chapter for HIIT Science as well. So we cover 20 different sports actually, but we will focus on global physiology, but then we'll move into soccer specific information. So the book really stems from, I guess, 2 literature reviews that were published in the journal Sports Medicine, and it really just extends on those, and that stemmed to the book and the course. All the same information, really. And really, we start with 10 science chapters in HIIT Science. These are really the crux of the foundation of what we believe you should have as a practitioner going in. And then we divert. We don't say we know it all in every sport, of course. So we bring in 20 world experts to tell us how they actually apply these principles within their sport of expertise. Okay, so I do triathlon with Dan Plews. Martin does, soccer, football, and on it goes across all those different sports. So we'll just start in and give you a little bit of background. This is chapter 1 is just basically an introduction to high intensity interval training, giving some background in that. So high intensity interval training is exercise consisting of repeated bouts of high intensity work performed above your lactate threshold, received exertion of hard or greater. This is work it's got to be in your red zone. So it's not sustainable exercise. It's above that so-called critical power or critical speed. And the hallmark of HIIT training is that it's these periods that are unsustainable are separated by periods of rest, relief, recovery, so that more high intensity work can subsequently be repeated. You can see we break these down into 5 different classifications or formats: long intervals, short intervals, repeated short sprints, repeated long sprints, and of course the team sport HIIT of choice, which is small-sided games or game-based interval training. All right, so that's the definition. Importantly, we recognize that HIIT is just one piece of the very complex programming puzzle for any practitioner in any sport, but it's often an important one. And getting a grip on your HIIT training can be really useful, valuable for yourself as a practitioner or coach, is just understanding how this all works. And I'll hopefully provide a good argument for that throughout the rest of the presentation. We always say that we should appreciate our context first and foremost before we form the content of the HIIT session that we're going to go about and put in place in front of the athlete and or coach. Okay, so context, we're referring to, what are the sport demands? What's the athlete, the animal that's sitting in front of you? What are they going to be able to do? What type of, genetic phenotype are they? What's their psychological state, their fatigue level, long-term adaptations that you're looking for in the HIIT session? What are the events of the day? Where are you in the whole periodization plan? Is COVID situation right in front of you, right? So these are all various different contextual considerations that must be in the back of your mind as a practitioner before you go and form your content. But nevertheless, having these content principles in the back of your mind established really assists you to come in according to the certain context and apply it appropriately. So content, what are we talking about here? We're talking about what is the desired physiological objective of the session? What are we trying to target? What's the format we can use to target that? What's the metabolism that's involved? How much neuromuscular load are we putting into this session? Are we integrating sport-specific skills? How much cognitive demand, the volume, the intensity of the workout, etc. So context always before content. Doesn't matter the sport you're in. These are fundamental principles you've got to have as a practitioner. Okay, so just 3 examples, broadly looking at 3 different sports. So take a triathlete, a rower, and a football player. So, we also need to know what's important first and foremost for that athlete. Rower, aerobic power, quite critical. 1-to-1 relationship between the power, the VO2 that you can produce at peak power and at peak power. So you want to have a high aerobic power. Fundamentally, we've got to be doing HIIT sessions that target this as a rower. In a triathlete, there's for the sport that I'm in with Ironman triathlon, I've got to appreciate that I need to be able to burn fat for long periods of time. And in my elites that I train a number of the top professionals in the world. They've got to have big VO2 max as well. It's big aerobic power. And that's so we've got to use HIIT sessions that target that. Football. Sorry, are we there yet? No, we're going to start with the triathlete. This is a pretty cool graph here. This was redone basically. I think it was Natter in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise in 2007. But we redid this graph that they started. And we got all of the contributors of HIIT Science to come in and tell us where they thought their sport should land on this continuum between the speed and strength and the endurance. We argued and debated this and placed that on there. And you can see, so for my triathletes, whether they're Olympic distance triathlete or an Ironman, we've got to have endurance as key, right? We can see our rower, cross-country skier, cyclist, they're all up and around that. But then if we move down to our, and I should also say that like physical ability is critical more than skills and tactics, right? Like we've got to be able to form a very physically, our like physical component needs to be optimized in our triathlete more than tactics and skills for success. They don't have the engine, they kind of can't play, if you know what I mean. We look to Martin's football player or soccer player. Again, as a practitioner, we got to appreciate it might not be quite the same. So we still have endurance as a key, and speed is very critical. But we've also got to appreciate that we've changed things here. Physical just diminished. This is according to Martin, down 25% versus skills and tactics. So we've got to, when we're looking at the big picture context for athletes, we do need to appreciate this. We can't come in guns blazing and go all physical. We've got to appreciate the various different skills and tactics. Martin's words, I'm not an expert in football like yourself there, Andrew, but that's his belief. So let's just take an example here of this play here. Tell me how much physical prowess is actually involved in this beautiful play that we're going to watch. Right. So Martin would argue that there's a lot more tactics and skills that are involved in that play than any sort of physical aspect. And you can, Andrew can debate that one all we want, but that's Martin's really important point there. That being fitter and faster, it can't guarantee success. But however, he says not being fit or fast enough can be a problem. We can't lose track of this. We need to emphasize the importance of skills, player interaction, and game insights or decision-making at the top level. However, we still must be aware and make sure that our players have the physical capacities to cope with the demands of the match and, of course, to execute their tactical roles efficiently, depending on where we're placing that, where that player is placed, right? They need to have physical attributes that meet those, that fit with the game model of the team. Okay, so it's just a little bit different. It's not just all physical. It's physical with a twist ultimately. So context is very important. Here's the two examples again, talking about a practitioner like myself in the sport of triathlon. I'm emphasizing physical, but less so with Martin, where he might be still emphasizing it, but just at a smaller dose. It's not to say it's not important. It's just to say that we need to, if we're part of the team, we need to be able to appreciate that these other factors are coming into play very much so, and it needs to be taken into context. So where does HIIT come into all of this? And, in our endurance model, it's very easy to understand how HIIT training, I guess, gives us the adaptation response that we're after to enhance the physical attributes of the athlete. And it's very useful for being able to form and shape around the various different sessions, other sessions in the week. These are all just, I guess, the stack here relates to the load of the session. And you can adjust how much, load that you want on that session. And that's why it's quite convenient. But it's really important in the team sports, because these sorts of strength and speed and activation components in the week are, they may be prioritized relative to the HIIT session. And again, HIIT can be formed, it can be placed around it, and it can be formed so that it doesn't interfere with some of these other important sessions, right? Depending on how much neuromuscular metabolic load is into that HIIT session. And we'll describe a little bit more of this shortly. And actually, to do that, we'll move into the HIIT versus concurrent training. This was written by Dr. Jackson Fife from Australia, and he writes chapter 6 for us. He's the world expert in this. But as we'll all be aware, endurance training on the left here is not always compatible to our strength training, right? Where we've got our endurance, our metabolic training is really there for improving our O2 delivery or O2 uptake, more mitochondria, and that's completely at odds with the form of a strength session where we're trying to gain strength. We're trying typically after muscle hypertrophy and power development. And the two are not necessarily compatible, right? And this is the whole phenomenon of concurrent training, and potentially there may be an interference effect that happens here, right? And to make a long story short, Jackson really kind of comes down to show that it's this neuromuscular fatigue that we get out of either a HIIT session or a strength session that it's not always compatible. So you need to be able to emphasize, well, what sort of neuromuscular strain do I really want to have in my program? So for me as an endurance specialist, I don't want any strength training sessions actually interfering with, say, a key run set that's going to have a neuromuscular emphasis. But in Andrew and Martin's case, they might not want to have an endurance session that has a heavy neuromuscular load that interferes with an important strength session that might be influencing an aspect of speed that we might be prioritizing in our players. So this is again where knowledge of how much load and the type of load in a HIIT session you have is going to be affecting the bigger picture of the program. Okay, so, and to appreciate a little bit more, we take people back to chapter 3 in the book and course, and that is really looking at these physiological targets of HIIT, and really physiological targets of any session. But we have, you can see, we break things down into training. According to Einstein, or someone quoted it, that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And, if we can take things as simple, when we do any sort of endurance training session, HIIT training session, metabolic training session, we will have a component of aerobic, heart and lungs and mitochondria, anaerobic, blood lactate or sugar burning, and then, and without oxygen, of course, and then a neuromuscular component, like a muscle damage or a muscle recruitment, a soreness. There'll be some sort of impact in that session. All right. So any training session was going to have a component of those three. So we can break down any sort of session into its degree of oxidative, anaerobic, or neuromuscular. So green, red, and black. And again, throughout HIIT Science, we teach the types of sessions that are going to have emphases on those different components. Right? We color code them, and we create these HIIT types. So when we're talking about the aerobic system, we're talking about heart and lungs and mitochondria. They've got different components of central and peripheral aspects to that aerobic system we've often talked about. And there's different ways that we can target these systems in the body. I wrote a paper a long while ago, 2010 now, and I looked at the interesting link from a molecular standpoint when we do either high intensity training or high volume training, right? And interestingly, these molecular signals actually wind up just hitting this exact same master switch. So both the high intensity and the high volume training. So the question, and all of these have the similar, the PGC1 alpha, and they all have similar downstream effects on your, whether you're going to make things more fatigue resistant, more mitochondria, more type 1 fibers, more fat burning, and more ability to soak up sugar. And the question here really becomes like, how much can we get the same bang for buck? Because we know how long high volume training takes out of a player, how much time it takes versus a high intensity training, which might be doing almost the same thing. And we see this often, and off camera, Andrew and I were just having a chat about this, and we see this so often that we see players running a lot of miles, and Martin is just he can't stand this sometimes because he just doesn't buy into the fact that we need to run more Ks. And Andrew, I'm not sure if you have any comment on that, or whether you agree or disagree with Martin's view on this, that we might be able to get this, just a more time efficient means of getting the same stimulus, or whether you see this in your sport.
Yeah, I have seen it. The days of the 12-minute run for the sake of a 12-minute run. I think personally, time is the biggest constraint. Intensity. Players, coaches want intensity. Maybe not of the physiological perspective that we look at, but that intensity, if you compare that high volume, lower intensity in a physiology capacity running, compared to something like high intensity interval training, you're getting more bang for your buck over a shorter period of time. So then it becomes a case of quality versus quantity. Well, I think, more is not better, better is better. So using interval training will give you the same responses as you've just identified in a shorter period of time, because as you identified earlier, it's a technical tactical sport, which is arguably more of the priority than developing endurance athletes, and that's for me where high intensity interval training and yourself and Martin's work is brilliant, because I agree with that. I think it's it doesn't take many people to work out that it's a high intensity intermittent sport. It's not a continuous sport. So therefore, when we think of things like specificity, are we being more specific with the interval training? Or are we being more specific with the endurance training?
Absolutely, yeah, well said, and I could not agree more. So I would argue that what we're seeing here is, in this example, is less specific to what is actually occurring in the game. So let's continue to be specific. So next physiological target is, of course, the one that's a little bit more specific to the sport, that repeated nature and fast moving, high intensity stimulus. And it's the anaerobic contribution, that's going to be depleting glycogen stocks, eliciting high, lactic and associated burn, and affecting perceived exertion. And it has a follow-on effect. So very important to appreciate in your programming, because it can mess you over for the next day, for example. And the big one that's coupled with that anaerobic response is the neuromuscular or musculoskeletal strain or response. So we really need to be cautious with this one because of injury risk, residual fatigue, and of course affects perceived exertion and performance ultimately. So again, why it's so important to be cognizant of that neuromuscular demand that's in any high intensity work. We can't always do high intensity work, or we're going to run into some big trouble. So, but like getting a grip on it and giving appropriate doses seems to be, a smart way to kind of go about your work. So we have the ability with HIIT to be very precise with our targeting. And we like the analogy of, do we use weapons of mass destruction versus Navy SEAL targeted kind of approach? And we believe we need to take the Navy SEAL targeted approach. So form our HIIT sessions accordingly, so that they might be, of an aerobic and neuromuscular nature, like the type 2 session, aerobic, anaerobic here in this example, that would be our type 3, and then all guns blazing. There is the time and place for that, and that's your aerobic, anaerobic, and neuromuscular. So we can color coordinate those ones as well, as you'll see. So this is a very busy roadmap, but when you actually get your head around it, it's actually quite useful. So we can see this is the whole entire picture of HIIT Science in one slide. This is what you learn. Appreciate your context, decide on the physiological type, and then you'll see you'll have your different types in terms of how much aerobic, anaerobic, and neuromuscular strain that you want. Build that up, and then choose the HIIT format or weapon that you want. And we've got all these different options at our disposal, right? We can launch short interval weapons. We can make them game based. We can use long intervals for certain ones. And notice the different types of intervals, formats can be used and formed accordingly to hit different target types. So we can use a similar format, like a short interval, for example, to hit these 4 different target types, depending on how we skin the cat, depending on how we make that format. Okay, so is really powerful as a practitioner to actually have that knowledge in your context and be able to apply it accordingly. Okay, so this is again what we teach, and we to learn how the weapons get formed and moved, we go into chapter 4. And unfortunately, in the interest of time, we can't go too deep into this. But we'll just say that there's about 12 different levers we can pull on to create this weapon. And the key one is really that intensity and duration of the work interval. So we'll just briefly look at that one. And if you're interested in further, you can kind of come into the course or book. But you can see across the intensity spectrum, we've got velocity of the intermittent fitness test here, sitting around there, and you've got your VO2 max, or the power velocity at VO2 max. At the very bottom, remember that HIIT by nature needs to be above your maximal lactate steady state. This is the red zone. We're all in the red zone here. This is all the intensity spectrum. This is right at the top. So this is as fast as you can run, or as much power you can produce on a bike or rowing ergometer. And here's all the intervals that sit in there, all the formats, right? So they're long intervals down here, short intervals here. You've got repeated all-out sprints here, sprint interval training right to the top. And your game-based high-intensity interval training or small-sided games can all be formed in there. Again, for yourself as a team sport practitioner, very useful. And all those basic, here are all the various different formats. So here's your long intervals, and they're basically, at around VO2 max exercise intensity, 80 to 90% of VIFT, and for 2 to 5 minutes with a 1 to 4 minute recovery. You've got your short intervals that are the most versatile. Notice all the different types. Depending on how we skin the cat here, we can hit all those different target types, the physiological targets that I mentioned, depending on how we want to have those. These are just a little bit higher in the intensity as I showed, but and 10 to 60 seconds of work duration, typically with 10 to 60 seconds of recovery duration. Okay, and then there's the repeated sprint training, these are all out short sprints, 3 to 10 seconds. You can see these bouts with 15 to 60 seconds of recovery or relief, and then usually these are in bouts or these are in sets with periods of recovery between those sets. Sprint interval training, right? So you've got these are all out. These are the ones that are used in a lot of the health literature that show their effect, but they're only of so much use in a soccer context, I would argue. And then there's the game-based training, which would be very useful in the soccer or team sport-based area, all right? And these are all the various different things that we can manipulate, from reduced player number to the presence of a coach, and on these go. But we can manipulate these ones with and use a ball, etc. So those are the different HIIT formats that we can have, and then we move into actually fine-tuning those. And to fine-tune those, again, taking us through, imagine we're the general, we want to have a good grip on our context. We know the target that we're after in that HIIT session. We choose the weapon, we adjust that weapon, the knowledge we know, make our final weapon, and we execute. So fine-tuning those, here's for an example with the short interval format in the context of the sport of soccer. Again, remember that we saw this intensity is sitting, around 90 to 105% of VIFT, so velocity of the intermittent fitness test, as achieved in your 30-15 intermittent fitness test, Martin Buchheit's work, and for anywhere from 10 to 60 seconds with equivalent 10 to 60 second recovery periods, and these which can be either passive or active depending on what you want. And again, remember that we can manipulate these to have type 1, 2, 3, or 4. And again, notice the different emphases of the physiological response to these. All guns blazing versus very low impact. Look on this side, we've got, just an aerobic, oxidative, green response, but low lactate or low neuromuscular response. This can be very useful. And this one too, notice the low lactate on these ones. How can you have a HIIT session with low lactate? How is that possible? Well, it's all down to this very cool protein that sits in your muscle. And you've probably heard of the protein called hemoglobin that sits in your blood, but maybe less you've heard of is the myoglobin. And that's this protein that does bind to oxygen, and it can be resaturated very, very quickly upon a rest of the muscle. And it's super useful for controlling the anaerobic contribution, the amount of lactate. So you can have a very low lactic session if you, I guess, skin the cat correctly and have longer pauses ultimately between your HIIT sessions. So notice here the aerobic contribution to a 10-second interval versus a 60-second interval. So 60 seconds, big O2 deficit, big anaerobic contribution, lots of lactate being produced. But notice in the 10-second interval, 10-10 here, notice the muscles has enough time to resaturate, and the myoglobin takes up that O2. It's like an O2 store, and it ultimately keeps and controls lactate so that it doesn't accumulate. And it's remarkable. We showed in this graph here, this is from our review, where these 10-10 and 20-20 second intervals, we can actually be at VO2 max, so breathing super heavy, but with a low lactic level of 4 millimoles. I mean, if you know your physiology, this is just phenomenal. And this was, I believe, from Sultan's group in Scandinavia in the 60s. He was the first to show this. And when Martin and I first saw this, we were just like, oh my God, that's incredible. So it's really, really cool that we can actually have these sessions appropriately produced and have these really low lactic type sessions that, so you're going to get a great stimulus out of it, but a player's going to walk through it and be feeling very fresh and recovered the next time they go about their business. Remember, consistency of training must be one of the key aspects that we're after as a coach or practitioner. We always want that stimulus happening on a regular basis for our athletes. Too big of or too inappropriate of a stimulus, and we're going to slow down that progress. We want to always be kind of like hitting that nail. Again, that's the analogy that I always like to use. I just always want to be hitting the nail with my hammer on the right targets. Okay, so I'm going to again move to the sport of football and soccer, and this is from Sports Performance and Science and Reports from Martin's work, Martin's journal. And here he's giving you a good example of how he manages high-speed running load in soccer players and how he uses HIIT training in that. And one of the things that when seasons are moving, like they're not at the moment, but when seasons are moving, we know that we have the situation where a coach will decide to bench a player. And of course, that creates a period of detraining in a busy situation where we can't get appropriate time to train them. And what happens? Well, often we'll reduce the acute to chronic load ratio. We get an injury. So here's a potential example of that. Right, so here's Henry, and he's down. As you can see, hamstring injury, right? And it's not, I'm not saying this is the key thing that causes this, but here's a theory, right? We're going to show a theory for why that may occur and what you might be able to do to prevent this incident. I'm sure everyone watching this has seen something like this in their experience. Okay, so on to chapter 8 in surveillance. We're monitoring this load, right? So we've got our external load, our internal loads. So if we're monitoring external load with GPS, we can potentially use that knowledge to, through our modeling, to supplement HIIT training in there, an appropriate amount of high-speed running load. Okay, so here's Martin's example in this paper, and we have distance performed above 20 kilometers an hour, for argument's sake, for simplicity. And you can see here's all the different games that are actually occurring, and we can see here's every time a game happens or the match, we can see a big spike in high-speed running load. We also, on the secondary y-axis, we've got the acute to chronic workload ratio. If you're familiar with this one, this is basically a marker that's looking, this is in yellow, and this is a marker that's looking at how much load actually happens relative to the background load or the fitness, right? So the chronic workload is the fitness, and the acute workload is how much load they actually incurred at that one time. And the general marker is that shouldn't be ever go above 1.5. Okay, and of course in this situation, play, match, no problem, hanging in there. But now coach is like not happy with this guy, gonna bench him. And of course, detrains every time there's a match, detrains. Oh, time to use them. And of course, wham, we have a potential injury. All right, so this is a potential occurrence in your world, right? Okay, so input the short interval. So we can form short intervals that target that high speed running. We can make them similar to the load in a game up in the type 4 with aerobic, anaerobic, and neuromuscular responses accordingly. Or we can have certain ones where they're, a type 2 response. So it's an aerobic response and a neuromuscular, keeping the lactate low. So lots of ways we can do this. And here's just some examples. So you can see the situation we just showed, and where the player was benched. Here he was subbed for 30 minutes. And then to keep up the load, we directly on the pitch after the home game, we throw in a type 1 HIIT session or a type 4 HIIT session. And then here's not even selected. So again, we're going to throw in a type 2 and a type 4 session to pick that high speed running up. And here's sub for 30 minutes. But again, according to the load that we need, we can throw in a type 2 session, bench, starter, full match. In this scenario where there was supplementation of the HIIT during, at a convenient place in the appropriate context, we save the situation. And here's some of the examples that Martin uses for what he does. So say, for example, 10 seconds at 110% of IFT, 20 seconds passive recovery. Note the low lactate response you'll get in that from 20 seconds of recovery between. Does this for 6 minutes. So again, this is a classic type 2 session, high speed running. For his defenders, a little bit different. You can see down here doing this a type 2, and this one there's a lot more change, smaller change of directions, less influence. But his argument is that we need the little bit, in accordance to context of the position, we'll need a little bit more neuromuscular, side to side kind of movements to protect some of those muscles. Again, out of my area of expertise, but the sort of the side to sides, movements are going to be a little bit more specific to the defenders versus the high speed running. But so yeah, different sessions for the different positions. And you can look at the total distance that's traveled in these 3 examples, the amount of high speed running for the specific player, and then but again, we can monitor all this using our GPSs if we're privileged to that. So in the new situation now where we go and we're no longer, we're still in this bench situation, but we supplement our HIIT sessions, and notice how the acute to chronic workload comes way down all of a sudden, and because we've supplemented with the appropriate amount. And in theory, we can lower the potential for injury. So that's it for me, and hopefully you take something of that that may be useful, team. And Andrew, again, thanks for letting us share. This is HIIT Science. We're 10 science chapters, 20 application chapters, and the discount until the 17th this month. So get in there if that's of any interest of learning team. So thanks, Andrew.
No problem. Okay. So I think that was brilliant. I really do. As you know, I'm a big fan of yours and Martin's work. I think the simplicity that you guys have brought to it as well is valuable for any practitioner, especially in a team sport where, as we spoke about earlier, those maybe the timescales are so much smaller, but you still have to be looking at the physiological response that you're getting from the players in context to the training model, the game model, the way you play. Some brilliant points there, and I would encourage anyone in this group to enroll on a course, because I think it's incredible. I've learned so much from the book, from the course, the soccer specific side of things. It's just it's opened my eyes a little bit more, because I think maybe when I was younger in my practitioner days, you may not consider neuromuscular strain. You should do, but you may not, and it may be you're thinking more of, right, what am I going to get out of this? And sometimes I think it's too easy, and I don't know how you would feel on this, to concentrate too much on the external metrics rather than just looking at a bigger picture of that puzzle and looking at the internal. Because I was asked a question from a presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, where I said that undertraining is arguably a bigger problem than overtraining. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, again, you're going to have your context, and everyone's an individual. So in my sport of triathlon, it's sort of the other way. It's often the overtraining, but I could see the argument where in a lot of the team sports that we probably could maybe be pushing our athletes a little bit further. I don't know that for sure, but every situation is going to be unique. And one thing I do know is that athletes can tolerate typically a lot more than you think. And typically also team sports by nature don't tend to have the same volume of training in them, but maybe that's a good thing too, right? Because it just, if the speed is the important aspect, then we need to be able to emphasize the things that are going to be producing that speed, right? Which could be less, that run training, like that we said, and more time in the gym, etc. So yeah, it's just so contextual, and so it's everyone has their sort of their view and their situation there. But again, coming back to HIIT Science, we have to have these principles. We have to work with the individual. We have to appreciate every individual's context, and then optimize for the team and the player.
Absolutely. And I think Martin's point on being fitter and faster won't particularly win you the game, but if you're not problematic, and where the HIIT fits into that puzzle of being able to say, okay, we're gonna target these qualities today. And I think that can be great for coaches as well. From my experience as a practitioner, when we look at small spaces, then you've got a lot of sort of quad dominant kind of accelerations and also the decels as well. But I think you now know that you can then go and top that up with some posterior chain HIIT. So you get your high speed running in there and work around that way. So actually you've hit quite a few things within one session that you need to get out of it. So maybe a heavier day for the athletes, and by manipulating HIIT variables, which are off the top of my head, there's about 16. Would it be right? Maybe more?
Yeah, it's 12.
12.
Yeah, it's enough. It's certainly enough.
I'll stick with 16. No, but I think
like 16.
Yeah, understanding those variables and how to manipulate them within a training week is huge. And the principles of training, of specificity and overload and those things, you can really target all of those things. I think if you said to any coach that game-based HIIT and small-sided games, you're going to get your biggest bang for buck, I think conversely, there's also that ceiling effect as well. So then you have your interval your short intervals or whatever interval training you're using there to get those key physiological qualities. I think it's easy to translate to players as well. I think you guys have done brilliantly. And if you look at aerobic, anaerobic, neuromuscular, color coding that, then when you go into those sessions and you plan that with coaches, it's pretty easy to say, look, what we're going to do today, you're going to get higher neuromuscular load. Therefore, you'll expect a few sore people tomorrow, or maybe perceived soreness, shall we say. which is often, that's always up for debate. But I think what the work you guys has done has certainly influenced my philosophy. And I think it's brilliant for everybody in this group for you to show that work. And I'm so glad you came on today.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me. And I hope your team there at Soccerology take some of these principles and can apply them in their work.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Paul. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you on today, and thank you so much. I'm sure the members will love it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.